Hi, it's Elise here at Bowman Library with a whole new middle grade book spotlight. So for this week, we are taking a look at historical fiction. But more specifically, we are taking a look at maybe a historical fiction that covers an event or a time in our history or in world history that does not get the attention it deserves, but should. So we're taking a look at historical fiction that maybe talks about a time you haven't read about before. And that's what I love about historical fiction, is it lets you explore times in our history that you never even knew existed because they weren't taught in school or they weren't shown on a TV show. We have 6 books that do exactly just that, so let's get started. Our first one today is Seoul Lantern. So 12-year-old Nozomi is growing up in Japan, more specifically Hiroshima. So 25 years have passed since the bombing of the city to end World War II, and Nozomi is starting to get to an age where she starts to ask questions, especially when it's time to gather for the annual lantern floating ceremony, which is held every year to remember those who were killed during this bombing. As she starts to ask questions and become more observant, Nozomi starts to realize that the trauma and scars, both emotional and physical, are still present from that event, and she decides she wants to do something about it. She wants to do something to make sure that everyone remembers what happened and that the stories from that day are remembered long time after this time. So she sets off on this project with her classmates to try to put all of that in one place to make sure everyone is remembered. This book is filled with true stories of events of that day, as well as what happened after. Like, the author interviewed survivors and families of survivors, and they are all incorporated in this story. I highly recommend this book, as a lot of times, this event is discussed as the end of World War II, the United States did this, and that's really where it's left, and nothing is really shared or discussed about what happened after, even years after, and how it impacted everyone still living there. This is Seoul Lanterns. Nest. So it's 1972, and Naomi, who goes by Chirp, is trying to enjoy her summer at home in Cape Cod, but something is not right. Her mother's having some issues with her legs, like there are some days she just can't move them, and it's very upsetting because her mother's a professional dancer. When her mother finds out that she is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, she falls into this incredibly deep depression. Chirp, her sister, and her father have no idea how to help her. It gets to the point where her psychiatrist father suggests that maybe her mother needs to go somewhere. So her mother leaves home to go somewhere who's going to help her, leaving Chirp and her sister kind of left up to their own devices. When her mother returns home, it seems that everything is back to normal, but quickly that changes, and then everything changes for the whole family in a way that no one even thought possible or imagined. The setting of 1972 plays a huge role in the discussion of medical treatment as well as mental health, as these topics were different in the past compared to how they are now, from how they were viewed to how they were discussed, handled, treated. It was incredibly eye-opening reading this and comparing to how we are today to how things were 50 years ago. So yeah, that was incredibly eye-opening. And now be warned, there is discussions, conversations, impacts of depression, as well as suicide are mentioned in this story, but this incredibly realistic historical look at how life was 50 years ago and how Chirp was just trying to survive the best she could with her family is incredibly eye-opening, and it's also heartbreaking at the same time. This is Nest. Finding Langston. So when 11-year-old Langston's mother passes away, his father almost immediately decides it's time for them to move from their home in Alabama to Chicago. It's 1946, and he feels isolated, he's bullied constantly, he doesn't fit in, and all Langston wants to do is to go back home, back where he knows and he loves and where the rest of his family is. One day, though, he finds that he's lost, and he stumbles across the public library. And he decides he's going to go inside and ask for directions. But then something amazes him. The public libraries in Chicago are for everyone. Back in Alabama, there were libraries that were for whites only, and there were libraries for blacks only because of segregation. But in Chicago, that's not the case. as he starts to immerse himself in these famous black writers and poets and creatives that he didn't even know existed, including his namesake, Langston Hughes, Langston starts to come with terms with his new life as well as the life he now has with his father. This historical look at what has now become known as the Great Migration is one that everyone should read and will want to finish as soon as you turn the first page, as you will be on this self-finding journey with Langston. This is Finding Langston. The Orphan Band of Springdale. So it's 1941 and the world is at war over in Europe. But so far the United States has been able to stay out of the conflict. But everyone knows that's not going to last. It's only a matter of time. Gusta's living with her parents in New York City, but her parents were German immigrants. They're poor and they're facing their own difficulties, especially her father. Her father is pro-union, he's very outspoken, some even consider him to be a fascist, and because of that, the federal government thinks her father is actually a German spy, and they are searching for him, and he's just trying to stay one step ahead of them catching him. Before she knows it, Gusta's brought to this bus stop, she's placed on this bus with a note, and she finds herself in Springdale, Maine, going to live with her grandmother who she's never met, and her grandmother owns this orphanage. And soon, Gusta finds herself living in this orphanage with a bunch of random kids that she's never met before. Gusta just wants to be quiet. She doesn't want to draw attention to herself, especially as townspeople there are already wary of new people to begin with, and then they find out that she is of German descent, and that just already right there makes them even more wary and untrustworthy of her. This look at how it was growing up with the upcoming World War looming, all while trying to figure out who you are, trying not, that you shouldn't let your heritage define you or let others define you for that reason, is an eye-opening but relatable read. And again, I think a lot of times we don't get to read a lot about how life was like before the United States went into World War II. Incredibly eye-opening. I highly recommend this one. This is The Orphan Band of Springdale. Finding Jin Kim. So Junie is ready for the first day of school of 7th grade, but that soon changes because as soon as she gets to school, it's a police scene. Racist graffiti was found in the school gym, specifically against Asian Americans. And this is not the first time that Junie and her crew have faced this. But they finally start deciding that it should be the last, and they want to speak out against it. Junie does not know if this is a good idea though, because she can't help but wonder if by speaking out, is it going to cause more retaliation and bullying against them? When she is given a school assignment to interview an elder, she decides that she wants to talk to her grandparents. And before she knows it and she starts asking them questions, they start to share what it was like for them to grow up in Korea during the Korean War. This book switches back and forth between present time with Junie as she's interviewing them to back in the 1950s in Korea when her grandparents were children, they were basically young teens, just like Junie is during present day. And it will make you see that, well, things have changed. Some things have not. And it's an incredibly eye-opening look at this time in history that is taught, but usually not from this type of perspective. When the Korean War is discussed, it's usually a pretty Americanized view of the Korean War. This book provides you such a different perspective that it kind of makes you sit and compare what you've heard and maybe what you should hear. There are discussions about violence, racism, there's depression, there's brief mentions of talking about suicide, but this is all about history, surviving, and growing from experience that help make a difference. This is Finding Jin Kim. And our last one for today is Armstrong and Charlie. So it is 1970s, 1974 to be exact, in Los Angeles, California, and it's the start of the school year. So first we have Charlie. Charlie is Jewish. He lives in the Hollywood Hills with his family, and his whole family is having a really hard time as they are still mourning the death of his older brother. And then there's Armstrong, who is black and he is angry because his parents, they signed him up for this new program the city's put together called opportunity busing. This was a real thing that happened in Los Angeles in which families could sign their kids up, it was when black students were sent to predominantly white schools in other parts of the city. in hopes maybe that, they'll get a better education. But Armstrong, he's angry because he doesn't want to have to leave his community, he doesn't want to have to leave his friends, and he knows he is not going to fit in. As they start the school year, both Armstrong and Charlie are facing their own problems and struggles, but as the year progresses, they soon find they have more in common than what they first thought, and maybe they are meant to be best friends. This book takes a look at what it was like to grow up in the 1970s, and you may find it maybe not to be as different as what it is today in some aspects, but it's all about how these two totally separate individuals come together with their own struggles, with their own problems, with their own backgrounds, and how they forge together to create a friendship in which they both need one another. This is Armstrong and Charlie. So these are the 6 of the historical fiction books we have here at the library, and I encourage you to come on out. Check out one of these, or we can help you find another historical fiction book, maybe about a time similar to one we talked about, or maybe one completely different, but you want to learn and read about that. Totally fine. We will be here to help you find that perfect historical fiction book. So I hope you have a great week, and I hope you tune back next week when we have a whole new middle grade book spotlight.